The wind howls across the desolate plains of South Dakota, carrying with it the ghosts of a tragedy that refused to stay buried. In the winter of 1973, a small patch of frozen earth became the stage for a conflict that defied every expectation of modern warfare and geopolitical logic. You are here because you know that history is never just about the winners. It is about the moments where the underdog stares down the Leviathan and refuses to blink. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden strategic shifts and the raw human drama behind the world's most shocking military upsets, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts who demand more than just the surface-level narrative. Today, we are focusing on the Wounded Knee incident of 1973, a 71-day siege where 71 Native American activists, armed with little more than hunting rifles, held the combined might of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Marshals Service at bay. This is not just a story of a standoff. It is a masterclass in asymmetrical resistance and a haunting reminder of how fragile the concept of absolute power truly is. When February 27th of that year dawned, the Pine Ridge Reservation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The tensions had been simmering for generations, but the immediate catalyst was the corruption and heavy-handed leadership of Dick Wilson, the tribal chairman. Many of the Oglala Sioux felt that their own governing body, backed by the federal government, had become an occupying force. They watched as their traditions were eroded, their resources were mismanaged, and their voices were silenced by a puppet regime. Russell Means and Dennis Banks, the key figures of the American Indian movement, stood at the precipice of a decision that would change the trajectory of indigenous rights in America forever. They were not looking for a fight in the traditional sense, but they were prepared to make a statement that the United States government could no longer ignore. They chose the village of Wounded Knee, a site eternally stained by the memory of the 1890 massacre. By choosing this ground, they weaponized history itself. They knew that any federal assault on this sacred and blood-soaked soil would be a public relations nightmare that the Nixon administration could ill afford. The takeover of Wounded Knee was swift and surgical. Within hours, the activists had fortified the village, seizing the trading post and the church. They began digging bunkers, creating firing lines, and organizing a perimeter that seemed absurd given the firepower at their disposal. On one side, you had a handful of men and women with bolt-action rifles and shotguns. On the other side, the United States government mobilized an armada of armored personnel carriers, military helicopters, and hundreds of federal agents armed with high-powered automatic weaponry. From a purely conventional military standpoint, the battle was over before it began. The FBI and the Marshals expected a quick resolution. They anticipated that a show of overwhelming force would shatter the resolve of those inside within 48 hours. They were wrong. They failed to account for the psychological terrain of the battlefield. The activists were not fighting for a tactical objective in the traditional sense. They were fighting for the survival of their culture, and that level of commitment creates a defensive posture that is nearly impossible to break with conventional military pressure. As the days turned into weeks, the FBI found themselves in a state of growing humiliation. Every attempt to tighten the noose only solidified the resolve of the defenders. The activists used the landscape to their advantage, utilizing the hills and the cover of the village to conduct hit-and-run harassment, keeping the federal forces in a constant state of hypervigilance. The federal agents, trained for conventional law enforcement or military operations against defined enemy combatants, were baffled by an adversary that refused to engage in a traditional firefight. Instead, the activists practiced a form of guerrilla resistance that was rooted in the ancient traditions of the plains. They relied on scouts, utilized the freezing nights to their advantage, and kept their lines of communication open to the media. This was the first time that a conflict on American soil was broadcast in such a way that the world could see the disparity between the giant and the underdog. The narrative began to shift. The public, initially told that these were dangerous radicals, started to see them as a group of people making a desperate final stand for their dignity. The logistical nightmare deepened for the federal government. Maintaining a full-scale siege involving hundreds of personnel and heavy equipment for weeks on end is an expensive and politically draining endeavor. The FBI command post became a center of frustration as orders from Washington changed based on the shifting winds of public opinion. They could not storm the village without risking a massacre that would be captured on camera, yet they could not retreat without signaling to the world that they were powerless against 71 riflemen. The stalemate forced the federal negotiators into a position they had never anticipated. They had to treat the occupiers as legitimate ambassadors of a sovereign people. This realization was a bitter pill for those in the high offices of the Nixon administration who viewed the activists as nothing more than criminals. Yet the reality on the ground dictated the terms. The defenders had turned Wounded Knee into a symbol of resilience, and as long as they held that ground, they controlled the narrative. Strategy in this standoff was defined by patience and symbolism rather than caliber or ballistics. Russell Means and Dennis Banks understood that the true battlefield was the minds of the American public. They ensured that every day of the siege was documented. They drew parallels between the 1890 massacre and their own struggle, effectively placing the U.S. government in the role of the aggressor. With every armored vehicle that rolled toward the perimeter and every helicopter that buzzed over the church, the federal government inadvertently reinforced the activists' claim that this was a war of extinction against the Native American people. The federal agents, for their part, were trapped by their own rules of engagement. They were tasked with ending the occupation, but the political cost of a violent resolution was too high. They became spectators to their own failure, watching as the perimeter remained unbroken, the supplies continued to filter in through secret routes, and the morale of the defenders remained unshaken. Life inside the siege was defined by cold hunger and an intense, almost spiritual commitment to the cause. The 71 individuals were not a unified militia in the sense of a standing army, but they became a tight-knit unit through the shared trauma of the experience. They spent the long nights whispering stories of their ancestors, sharpening their hunting rifles, and listening to the distant drone of federal aircraft. They knew they were likely walking into a death trap when they arrived, but as the days stretched into 2 months, the realization dawned on them that they were winning a different kind of war. They were successfully holding the attention of the nation. The federal government, meanwhile, was experiencing a slow-motion collapse of its authority. The sheer embarrassment of being unable to pacify a small village with the full weight of the U.S. military apparatus created ripples of dissent within the government itself. Agents were exhausted, their tactics were exposed, and their reputation as an invincible force was disintegrating with every passing day of the standoff. The turning point was not a military victory, but a realization of the impasse. By the time the final negotiations began in May, the federal government was desperate for an exit strategy that did not involve more violence. The surrender was negotiated with a level of irony that history rarely provides. The activists did not truly lose. They had achieved their primary goal of bringing the plight of their people to the national consciousness. They had forced a dialogue that had been ignored for decades. When the final riflemen walked out of the church, the optics were not those of a defeated insurgency, but of a group of people who had fought to a draw against the greatest power on earth. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had succeeded in regaining control of the land, but they had suffered a permanent wound to their prestige. The 71 days of the Wounded Knee incident left an indelible mark on the American psyche, serving as a reminder that when individuals are pushed to the brink, their willingness to sacrifice everything can render the most advanced military technology obsolete. The aftermath of the siege was complex and painful, leading to years of legal battles and deep divisions within the reservation itself. Dick Wilson remained in power for a time, backed by the federal government, But the image of the stoic resistance at Wounded Knee became a foundational myth for the modern indigenous rights movement. The standoff proved that even in the modern era, the power of a committed group to disrupt the status quo is immense. It demonstrated that military supremacy is not the only factor that determines the outcome of a conflict. Determination, strategic positioning, and the ability to control the narrative are just as vital. For the history enthusiast, this incident remains a fascinating case study in how the weak can leverage the vulnerabilities of the strong. The FBI, once take years ordeal, with a tarnished image from the 71-day ordeal, with a tarnished image that would take years to polish. The activists, though they faced individual consequences, succeeded in their collective aim to force the silence to be broken. One na kastel help but Kenya's other historical struggles were the Alodisto Ostos, where the underdog defied the odds. It is a testament to the fact that history is a cycle of resistance against power. We often look at battles and see only the weapons used and the tactical movements plotted on the field. Wounded Knee 1973 was a collision of two worlds. The Cold Knee 1973, those bureaucratic machine of the American state, and the burning, desperate, and deeply human spirit of those who had nothing left to lose. The fact that the activists managed to survive for 71 days with hunting rifles against the most sophisticated law enforcement and military apparatus in the world is not just a curiosity. It is a tactical miracle that deserves careful study. It reminds us that every system, no matter how powerful it appears, and that sometimes that point is found in the most unlikely of places. As we look back on this event, what we see clearly how the arbiter of the conflict, as the ultimate arbiter of the conflict. By framing the narrative as a humanitarian struggle, the activists forced the federal government to work within the constraints of public accountability, which severely hamstrung their operational effectiveness. If this had occurred in a vacuum, the outcome might have been a vacuum, the outcome might have been vastly different. But history does not happen in a vacuum, and the role of the observer is often as powerful as the role of the combatant. The standoff was a theater of the real, where each side played a part, but only one side was fighting for their own survival, which gave them an edge in endurance that their counterparts could never replicate. The federal agents had an end time for their shifts. The occupiers in motivation is the core of why so many powerful empires have historically folded under the pressure of smaller, localized insurrections. The legacy of Wounded Knee continues to resonate today. The legacy of Wounded Knee continues to resonate today. It serves as a stark reminder that the history of a nation in the blood of those who dared to stand up when the world told them to kneel. For those of you who want to dive deeper into these stories of unlikely combat, of the small forces that halted the progress of giants, of the small forces that halted the progress of giants, and of the strategic blunders that turned the tide of history, we are just getting started. If you found this breakdown of the Wounded Knee standoff insightful, and you want to see more content that explores the tension between powers and resistance, make sure is to bring these stories to life with the rigor these stories to life and detail they deserve. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think the federal government could have handled the situation differently, or was the outcome inevitable once the activists took the ground? Your engagement helps us continue to produce high-level content. And readings chopes. We love reading your debates. Until our next deep dive into the annals of military history, stay curious, stay analytical, and remember that history is never as simple as it seems. There is always a story behind the record. And we are here to pull it into the light. Thank you for walking through these 71 days with us, and we will see you in the next installment of our journey into the moments that defined our world.